You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, recording in Washington, D.C.
And I'm your co-host, Katie Putz, also in Washington, D.C.
Hey, Katie, how's it going today?
Going well, going well. It's been an exciting December.
It really has. We're turning our attention this week to something I know listeners have been wondering about, and we didn't want to jump on it when things were fresh and in motion. But of course, we're talking about South Korea's really remarkable political crisis. A political crisis that seemingly erupted out of nowhere. This began essentially on December 3rd local time at, I believe, 10:23 p.m. specifically, when President Yoon Suk-yeol of South Korea declared martial law. And I got a push alert on my phone. Everybody around the world got push alerts that the South Korean president had just declared martial law, and this was surprising news. South Korea is a liberal democracy, and so you don't really expect to be woken up by news of a martial law declaration in a country like that. And there hadn't really been proximal indicators for most of the world, but we can maybe talk about some of the rumors that have been swirling in South Korean politics in the months leading up to this. Anyways, long story short, the martial law declaration really created a dramatic, roughly 6-hour period that evening. I'm sure by now listeners have seen and read about the remarkable scenes out of Seoul that evening. The declaration was ultimately ended by a demonstration of democratic resilience. The country's national assemblymen, i.e., lawmakers, were able to convene and vote to overturn the martial law declaration, which President Yoon complied with, but that led into a broader period of uncertainty about Yoon's political future. That manifested in one failed impeachment vote against President Yoon. And then finally this weekend, we're recording this on December 17th, the National Assembly voted to impeach President Yoon Suk-yeol, who now marks the second consecutive conservative South Korean president to have faced impeachment. We still don't know what happens next. There is a constitutional process where the Constitutional Court has to weigh in on the validity of the impeachment vote. There's a little wrinkle there because the court isn't technically fully seated, and there's a debate among South Korean legal experts, which I am definitely not, about what that might mean for how the court will view the impeachment decision. But if there's anything close to, I think, consensus in South Korea around Yoon himself, is that his political career is essentially over, that he does not survive this in any shape or form. So, Katie, that's my kind of quick attempt to distill a lot of this. How have you made sense of all this? I mean, what was your reaction when you saw this news, and how have you kind of made sense of what's happened since?
Yeah, I mean, for our listeners who are bad with time zones, here in Washington, it was about 8:30 in the morning. And so we were all awake for the entirety of the martial law period. But if you had gone to bed in Seoul at 9:30 p.m., you might have slept through the entire thing, which is really a remarkable thing to think about. And especially if you see sort of some of the scenes that had happened in particularly around the National Assembly that night, where you had sort of soldiers trying to get into the building, you had civilians standing off with them. It was pretty wild. But getting back to sort of how we understand this, I think it's also kind of interesting to remark, and you mentioned that, this is the second conservative president in a row in South Korea to be impeached. Park Geun-hye was impeached in early December of 2016, so just a little over 8 years ago. It's kind of remarkable how those lined up, and to give our listeners a bit of a mental timeline, at least, I think she was ultimately removed in March of 2017 when the Constitutional Court sort of confirmed that impeachment vote. So that's sort of the timeline we think about, but it is more complicated because the court is not fully seated. I am also not a South Korean legal expert, so it will be interesting to watch how that plays into this. But it is pretty clear that South Korean public is certainly done with Yoon. I think his party is also pretty done with Yoon. The first impeachment vote failed because his party didn't show up to vote, so there wasn't a quorum. But in that second vote, 12 members of the PPP voted to impeach him, which signals, he no longer had a home in his party. And they were, previous to that second impeachment vote, there was some wrangling about some middle path, because I think the conservatives in South Korea know what happened the last time, which was after a conservative president was impeached, the Democratic Party was able to attain the presidency, and we had the presidency of Moon Jae-in. So I'm curious, Ankit, about, do you think that that play will sort of be on show again? Is that the direction that this is going in, or are there potential other sort of spoilers in that on the domestic level? And then we can kind of get into the geopolitics of it.
Yeah, so I mean, there's obviously geopolitical implications about the turn in South Korean domestic politics here. I mean, look, my read on the situation in Seoul is that there is not only anger at Yoon, but particularly after the first failed impeachment vote, and actually the dynamics leading into the second vote, where 12 members of the PPP, the People Power Party, were willing to defect in what was an anonymous ballot, by the way. This was not a public
Mm-hmm.
vote. There's quite a bit of anger at Yoon's party now because I think they've been seen as essentially placing party above South Korea's democracy, and I don't think that's a particularly incorrect assessment of the situation. And so, very strong expectation in all sectors that this will lead to a huge anti-incumbency wave against South Korean conservatives, resulting, if there is a special election after the Constitutional Court validates the impeachment, which will result in Yoon's removal from office. A victory for the Democratic Party, whose candidate is likely to be Lee Jae-myung, who is the leader of that party, who ran against Yoon in the last South Korean presidential election. So yes, I think the parallels with the 2016-2017 period are rather remarkable. Moving us a little bit towards the geopolitical side of this, what's also remarkable is that entire crisis with Park Geun-hye was also taking place against the background of a Trump transition in Washington, right? Resulting in sort of a phase shift. A lot of us who work on the U.S. ROK alliance can't help but observe that it's really rare that you get extended periods where you have a liberal and a liberal, or a conservative and a conservative, in both Washington and Seoul. And so there is often this kind of mismatch post 2000 in particular in the US ROK alliance that results in kind of strange alliance dynamics and kind of occasionally engagement or lack thereof towards North Korea. And so a lot of that, I think, will start seeping into the geopolitics discourse around a lot of this.
Yeah, we are at this juncture about a month out from Donald Trump's second inauguration, and we also, I think, have to remark on the just great uncertainty, not just in South Korea, obviously at this moment, but regionally and globally. In Japan, Prime Minister Shiba Shigeru presides over a minority government after a pretty disastrous snap election in October. And that also sort of will feed into those alliance dynamics. So, I'm curious about your thoughts, Ankit, on that U.S., South Korea, Japan trilateral at this moment. I mean, obviously with a acting president in South Korea until the impeachment question is decided, a new Trump administration, which we don't know really yet how it's going to approach these alliance dynamics. So it is a big toss up, but I'm curious about where you think that trilateral will kind of go in the next couple of months, if not couple of years, depending on how these things sort of flatten out.
So probably nowhere, right? So one of the things that was not uncommon to hear about Yoon in Washington that was often framed as a positive is that Yoon is not a normal politician. I think we've seen the results of him not being a normal politician with the martial law declaration, but a way in which that manifested positively for the Biden administration, which was very interested in promoting trilateralism in Northeast Asia, was that Yoon was very willing to openly say incredibly unpopular things about Japan, unpopular things that the United States would love to have a South Korean president say, right? Yoon publicly I remember seeing this and thinking it was pretty remarkable. Yoon said it made sense for Japan to develop a counterstrike capability before former Prime Minister Kishida oversaw the rollout of Japan's 2022 national security strategy. Yoon, of course, very much supported U.S.-backed efforts to promote trilateralism, including the historic Camp David summit. Now with Yoon gone, however, you have, again, a Democratic Party that was very critical of all of those steps to bring South Korea closer to Japan. Some of our listeners that followed Japan-South Korea relations during the last Democratic Party presidency under Moon Jae-in will recall that there was a pretty serious crisis between Japan and South Korea, right? You had a radar lock-on incident where The Japanese alleged that a South Korean vessel had locked its fire control radar on a Japanese aircraft. You had the results of a South Korean Supreme Court decision on restitution for wartime forced labor, which the Japanese were not very happy about. You had a variety of other crises related to historical matters. A lot of that, I think, is likely to return, despite, as you noted, Ishiba in Tokyo is actually a big promoter of trilateral cooperation. He is far more enthusiastic about trilateralism and closer ties with South Korea than even Kishida was. I mean, Kishida went along with it, but he wasn't particularly unenthusiastic. And I think in Tokyo, the fundamental case against moving too quickly with South Korea was precisely because of this perceived domestic political risk in the country, right? You saw this with Park Geun-hye too. In December, I think it was December 2015, Park Geun-hye very suddenly unveiled what at the time South Korea portrayed as a final settlement of the comfort women issue with Japan. That had no domestic political buy-in, and so that obviously was not a final settlement of that particular issue, which very much became, again, a pressure point in Japan-South Korea relations when the Democratic Party returned to the fore. So structurally, I think you're going to see a lot of the trilateral progress that took place under Yoon essentially evaporate, right? The other variable, of course, being that you're going to have an administration in Washington that doesn't think in trilateral or minilateral terms like the Biden administration, right? If there's anything we can say about the Trump administration's approach to foreign relations in general, is that it's bilateralism all the way, with allies, with adversaries alike. And so that's kind of my long, short answer to you, Katie. I mean, I think it's all going to sort of go poof.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I want to go back to the martial law declaration and talk about North Korea, because Yoon essentially accused the opposition in that declaration of doing North Korea's dirty work inside the South Korean government. That not only sort of smacks of this deep conspiracy theory sort of world that we kind of currently live in and exists in South Korea, also it was very sort of remarkable to me to see that language in that declaration. How has North Korea reacted to this? I mean, I'm not going to give sort of any space. I don't think there was any validity to those claims about the South Korean opposition sort of working for Pyongyang. But how did North Korea view any of this? What have they been doing in the last 3 weeks while we've been sort of watching South Korea so closely?
So yeah, so first of all, that language from Yoon and certain members of his party towards the opposition Democratic Party has sort of been there for a while. Yoon has regularly referred to members of the Democratic Party as anti-state forces and things like that. It's very kind of for South Koreans who lived through the Cold War, it very much harkens back to a lot of the anti-communist rhetoric that was prominent when South Korea was a dictatorship, which obviously has dark reverberations in the current democratic context of South Korean politics. Look, the North Koreans, I think, were caught off guard. They did not react immediately. They kind of took their sweet time to make sense of what was happening. But then when they did come out, the reaction I thought was pretty typical. They called Yoon Suk Yeol insane. That's their word, not mine. They used this as an example to, I think, show their own people that South Korea was politically unstable. They broadcast images of South Koreans protesting, right, which is interesting. I mean, they did this with the Park Geun-hye impeachment as well. You would think that that's the kind of imagery that Kim Jong-un would not want to portray to his own people, that there are Koreans who can go out in the streets and protest against their own government. But because it kind of feeds into this narrative about North Korean superiority, North Korea being this kind of stable society versus South Korea being this messy democracy, I think there was much more of a pro versus con, so to speak, when it came to the propaganda angle there. Of course, there's a big change in the political context in inter-Korean relations since the Park Geun-hye impeachment, which is that North Korea no longer supports Korean unification. They treat South Korea as a foreign country, not as part of a Korea that they aspire to unify under the North Korean system. So that context, I think, also helps explain why they were willing to take a little bit longer here. What I think will be really important to watch is how the North Koreans are going to comment about the prospect of a return by the Democratic Party, because one of the core priorities of the DP will be to try and resume engagement with the North Koreans, right? The conservatives and the progressives in South Korea just have diametrically opposed views on what to do about the North Korea problem. For you, and it's all been deterrence, defense, flying drones over Pyongyang, threatening the North Koreans with regime change. For the DP, it's going to be very much similar to what we saw in 2017, 2018, and 2019 under Moon, which is try to pick up diplomatic engagement with Kim Jong Un. The North Koreans, I think, will not be eager to reciprocate that, but it will be interesting to see if they have any interest in potentially re-engaging.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll have to see how this plays out, but it's obvious that there's quite a bit of uncertainty here.
Yeah, I think that's putting it lightly. There's a lot of other things we could get into. I mean, there's the China piece of this as well, which
Hmm.
I think is worth talking about briefly, right? Uh, and look, I mean, the China piece is complicated. There's kind of an oversimplistic view sometimes in Washington that progressives in South Korea are pro-China and anti-U.S. That's not the case. I think the better way to describe it is that they have a stronger preference for strategic autonomy in how South Korea engages both China and the United States. And so that is likely to manifest in a unwillingness, essentially, to play hardball on China with the United States. Which, I mean, don't get me wrong, the Yoon administration took a lot of goading to start talking about things like Taiwan in kind of public statements and things like that. But they eventually got there. I think a lot of that is going to go away. You are likely to see, I think, the DP try to essentially have an even keel between the United States and China, with the added factor of managing Donald Trump, which is
Hmm.
going to, I think, further complicate that. So, but all of this is TBD, of course, because we don't even know when the election is going to be and, how things might
If there's
change
going to
very
be an
quickly.
election.
If there's going to be an election, very likely there will be, but again, lots of uncertainty, as you said.
Yeah, and one more piece on that China angle is the sort of the folks that Donald Trump has said that he wants to be a Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, sort of viewed as China hawks, Marco Rubio being one of them. And so that is Marco Rubio, correct? I'm not
Mm-hmm.
getting my names mixed up. If he becomes Secretary of State, he's sort of viewed as a China hawk, and so how that will pair up with a potential progressive sort of lighter on China, less confrontational, will be interesting to watch in the months to come.
Indeed, absolutely. There's a lot to watch for here. But I think the bottom line here is I think I mean I think this is a reminder of many of the at least for South Koreans who remember the pre-democracy era, that a lot of that DNA from the authoritarian days continues to sort of linger in certain parts of conservative South Korean politics, right? I think the investigations that have taken place into kind of the people that were close to Yoon that played a role in this martial law plot are frankly pretty remarkable. But also, by the same token, I think this was also a clear reminder that South Korea's democratic institutions have been very resilient, right? I think what Yoon tried to do here was essentially a self coup, right, or an autogolpe, as the Spanish call it, trying to sort of seize power as a legitimately democratically elected incumbent, and South Korean institutions were able to resist that. I mean, granted, there was a fair degree of incompetency as well. The South Korean media, including Yonhap News, the state news agency, was reporting on the coup attempt as it was playing out, right? I mean, that's kind of coup 101 is you don't let the media do that. But in any case, really remarkable turn in South Korean politics. But I think this will be an episode that will continue to be, of course, studied for a while. And as these investigations in South Korea continue, I think there'll be additional remarkable headlines about really what could have been and indeed what happened on that night of December 3rd. All right. Well, Katie, I think we'll wrap it up there for today. Thanks, as always, for joining me on the show. Um, I have to say, I guess this is going to be our final episode for 2024. So I do want to wish all of our listeners a very happy holidays, season's greetings, and a happy new year. We'll be back in 2025 with the Asia Geopolitics podcast. As always, make sure you subscribe to the show so you can keep up with future episodes when we're back. And if you have suggestions for content you'd like to have covered on the show, do reach out to either of us. We're very happy to take that into consideration. And as always, thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.